school discipline, the school to prison pipeline, and how the ways that all the elements around racism and how classism can play out in schools, how those sort of come together in the question of discipline. It's the only really specific area that we're covering in this whole class, and I think that as we go through, hopefully it'll be clear why. So I went to the Office of Civil Rights on the federal government. Different states do different kinds of reporting, and Vermont doesn't have publicly available discipline reporting except for through OCR. So these data are from 2015, which is the most recently reported OCR information. So I took three cities and towns. I took Bennington, Brattleboro, and Burlington. And so here I just grabbed four graphs from each site. So Bennington, I'm going to look at first. So for each of the towns, the first upper left-hand graph is the district enrollment by race. White students are blue, black students are yellow, multiracial students are purple, and the other colors are also listed there. So there's 1,000 students enrolled in Bennington, just over. 20 in general, 91.9% of students are white and just under 3% are multiracial. When we look at school suspensions, there are still 91.7 this time percent of students who were in school suspended were white, and all the remaining students were of two or more races. So I think that already right there we can see a really notable jump. There were 24 students who were suspended in school. These are not non-duplicative counts. So now we move down to the bottom left corner, we see out of school suspensions. Some of these could be the same kids from the 24. Here we've got 37 kids who are out of school suspended, 89% white, and then split just half and half between black students and multiracial students. So a higher proportion of black students in general, I think it looks like, are about 1% of students in Bennington, but make up 5.5% of the students who were suspended out of school. There are only 2 expulsions in the whole district, which is great, and that's a good low rate. Both students who were expelled are white, and we don't have much information beyond that. What this doesn't look at is students who were placed in alternative educational environments and what the sort of breakdown of that is. A lot of times there are things that function essentially as expulsions but aren't tracked as expulsions because of the order of the placement. Expulsion only is if the student is officially listed as expelled before there is an alternative placement. They can have up to 10 days of non-placement in between a suspension and a placement. So expulsions are pretty rare as a result. So if we look at Brattleboro, we got a similar situation where all of the students that are in school suspended are either white or of 2 or more races. It's 19 students. Every student who is out of school suspended or expelled is white. So that's a difference in Brattleboro. And then we pull over to Burlington. In all of Vermont that I could find, Burlington has the highest proportion of black students. And as we'll talk about as we keep going, black students are at highest risk in terms of school discipline in a national sense. So Burlington is 64.5% white students, 14.8% black students. And those are the only 2 numbers we're going to keep looking at as we go through here, but feel free to continue to explore the graph. So in-school suspensions, 41% instead of the 64% in the general population are white, and 36% of the students within school suspension are black, which is overrepresentation of about 2.5 times. There were 172 in-school suspensions and 171 out-of-school suspensions. out of school, also less than half the students out of school suspended were white, and 35%, so very similar, were black. Again, an overrepresentation of about 2.5 times. So I definitely encourage you to go to ocrdata.ed.gov. I've got the link at the bottom of the screen and look through more of this. There's a whole bunch of data, and I'm going to pull out some more, but there's plenty to explore. So I'm pulling out more from Burlington because I think that Burlington is racially a particularly diverse area. And another thing that we know, another thing that statistics show, is that students with disabilities are at higher risk for suspension and expulsion, and especially boys with identified disabilities, and especially Black boys with identified disabilities. And so this is pulling out, breaking up the first graph looks really at sort of how gender, race, and disability play together. So the blue bars are male, the green bars are female. So we've got non-disabled students, which means students that are not identified to need an IEP. I believe students who require a 504 are somehow tracked under non-disabled. There's a lot of questions about that, but so if we look at all students, I want to be clear that the scales on the side are not the same, which makes things complicated because they look really different. So of all students, about 4.7% of boys and 2.3% of girls receive out of school suspensions. Of students without disability or with identified disabilities, we're at about 18% of boys and about 20% of girls. So drastically higher, 4 to 18, 2 to 20. And so that's regardless of race, just looking at disability and sex. So once we start pulling things out by disability and sex, if we look at Black students in particular, we see that the top graph, it looks like, wow, non-disabled Black boys receive the highest rates of out of school suspensions. But really, when we look, that says 12.2%. And for Black students with disabilities, Black boys with disabilities, we're at 27%. Black girls without disabilities, 6.1%. Black girls with disabilities are out of school suspended in Burlington at a rate of 42%. That is almost half of them. And what I want to talk about, and we'll talk more as we keep going, is that missing school means missing time on learning, means falling further behind, means not getting IEP related services, and then having more to catch up on when learning is already slower or more challenging, right? We look at white students, so non-disabled white students receiving out of school suspensions, 2.8% for boys, 1.3% for girls, far lower for both of them, about half the rate of students overall. And for white students with disabilities, we're at 12.8% for boys and 13% for girls. So what is that? About 4 times as high for boys and 6 times as high for girls. Sorry, about 10%, 10 times higher for girls. So drastically different. Just a few more pictures around this. The final set of pictures, with the blue as the base, is looking at who has identified IEPs. As you'll see, if you recall, the proportion of white students in general in Burlington was about 64%, and how 79% have IEPs. 79% of the people with IEPs, are white. And so that's an overrepresentation of about 25%. And I think that's worth thinking about, is why do we think that that many more white students have IEPs than their representation in the whole school district? There's a lot of possible reasons, but one of it is an over-identification based on who is sort of seen to be working the hardest, right? Like we talked about that 4 classes ago, back when we were looking at sort of race and poverty and how they intersect and who gets seen as trying hard, so who gets seen as needing extra support to do well versus who just gets seen as not working at it and so not getting or deserving extra support. So we look at the in-school suspensions. So again, here we see that Black students with disabilities are overrepresented even as compared to white students with disabilities for in-school suspensions. We see that 55 out of the 300 students that were suspended are students with disabilities. And then for out-of-school suspensions, we see that 65 out of, I think, 170. So while students with disabilities are at a slightly lower rate of getting in-school suspended based on their overall representation, they're at a significantly higher rate of out-of-school suspensions. And again, here we see that Black students with disabilities are represented at double their rate in the population of students with disabilities in this out-of-school suspension category. I would really love to encourage you to spend some time exploring the OCR page, and I'm going to talk more about it later in terms of what I'd like from you, but the other piece of it is even exploring some other districts nearby. Some districts that are super majority white, which I know a lot of districts in Vermont are, which is represented as over 90% white, then there's still a lot to look at in terms of disability, in terms of gender. There's not as much breakdown by class on the OCR page, but if you look deep enough, you can find some stuff. So this is the referrals to law enforcement officers, and I think a lot of people have heard about school to prison pipeline. I've mentioned it briefly, and there's a lot of ways that that plays out. One way is that we know that Black boys who are not reading at grade level in 3rd grade are significantly more likely to end up in prison, right? So there's the education gap and the performance debt. There is the fact that as students are suspended, they miss school, miss time on learning, miss content and instruction, fall further behind, and are less able to succeed in a way that provides them with the economic and life opportunities outside of prison. There are the ways that students get sort of turned into categories, turned into the bad kids, turned into the good kids, turned into the people who are going to fall through the cracks. And then there's also referrals to law enforcement that happens directly from the school. And so this is again Burlington, and this is also from the OCR page, and I wanted to pull out the ways that students are getting referred to law enforcement. So here we are looking at all the students in the district. That's on the right. And students who have disabilities, that's on the left. So all students without disabilities, 0.6% are referred to law enforcement. All students with identified disabilities, which they call here IDEA students for Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, 2.6% are referred to law enforcement, so about 4.5 times as many. There are a large number, 0.4% of white students without disabilities, 2.6% of white students with disabilities, 1.7% of Black students with disabilities, 4.5% of Black students with disabilities. So again, like about 3 times, almost 3 times, 2.5 times higher. There are fewer, there's almost no that I can see Latinx students who are identified as having disabilities. So none of them are referred to law enforcement. But if you look over at the other chart, we've got maybe 1.5% of students are Latinx, that little tiny pink bar in the first of the 2 graphs, and then 11.8% of the referrals to law enforcement are Latinx students. So this is another way that this operates. Who begins to get a record while they're still in school? Who has the opportunity to have things cleared and brushed under the rug? 61% of students without disabilities are white, and 41% of students referred to law enforcement without disabilities are white. So an underrepresentation of about a third. So where are the gaps? So I wanted to look at these in and out of school suspension rates for all the counties in Vermont. This is from a publication called Kicked Out that looks at suspension and expulsion in Vermont. It's on the Vermont Human Rights Commission site. Again, the link is at the bottom. Definitely feel free to explore it. And so in-school suspension rates for students with IEPs is higher in every single county. And from visual inspection, it looks like in every county besides Caledonia, it's between 2 and 6 times the rate. Out of school suspension rates, it is also very high. And in Caledonia County, it's worth noting, it looks like it's about 15 to 20 times higher for students with IEPs. So Caledonia County had a lower rate for in-school suspension for students with IEPs, but a higher rate for out-of-school suspension. So I think it's worth noting that sometimes you have to look at more than one part of the data to get a fuller picture of things. So the total Vermont numbers are about 2.5 times the rates of in-school suspension for kids with disabilities and about 3 times the rate of out-of-school suspension for kids with disabilities with IEPs. Different counties than the ones with this. But Windham and Chittenden both had almost 100 referrals to law enforcement per 1,000 students. And it might be total. I don't know if this is per 1,000 students. And the total number of school-related arrests by county, again, Windham and Chittenden are topping things out here. So we're looking at who's calling the police in, who's making these referrals to law enforcement, who's getting arrested, and where is that a decision that gets made more quickly, and where is that a decision that's more of a last resort? Where are the teachers given the support that they need to effectively be able to manage behavior within their classroom? Where are students given the support they need to effectively manage their own behavior within the classroom? Where are we creating trauma-informed schools that create more space to support a wider range of behaviors? And where do people feel at the end of their rope with their students and start calling in law enforcement? So, whole school approach. The main whole school approach I want to talk about, there's a whole range of whole school approaches to behavior, and I definitely encourage you to look into them, talk about them on the discussion board if you'd like to. But I wanted to talk about specifically restorative and transformative justice as an approach that looks at the needs of the school community as well as the specific students. But it never starts from a student to student perspective. It starts from a whole school perspective. And it starts by creating healthy relationships between students and each other, between students and educators, and between educators and each other. And so that happens through, I'm going to just show you a video in a second, the Circles curriculum, where we are teaching the skills that people are going to need to be able to have healthy relationships and healthy interactions with each other, and what they're going to need to be able to name for themselves what they need and to hold themselves and each other accountable. Often when we look at restorative justice processes, they come in specifically after something has been disrupted. A true restorative justice approach starts before the disruption. If we try to bring it in after, people don't have the necessary skills to be able to complete the process effectively, and then we say, well, I guess restorative justice doesn't work. Well, I guess that's not a thing that can happen here. But if we're creating a whole school approach to it, and we are committing as a school community to take a restorative or transformative justice approach, then we have already been laying the groundwork for the honest and challenging conversations and honest and challenging asks that restorative justice has after the behavior. So, build healthy relationships, reduce, prevent, and improve harmful behavior. What are we teaching? What are we providing in terms of the resources for students to be able to not have to enact the behavior that's harmful? What are we doing in order to help create classroom communities where the relationships and the container of the classroom matter enough that that's what's prioritized? Then 4 steps in, then we start. There's always, no matter how great we do in terms of antecedent management, no matter how great we do in terms of providing these skills and these supports and these relationships in advance, things are still going to get messed up sometimes, right? So then step 4, we figure out how to repair harm, restore positive relationships, and then we resolve conflict. We hold individuals accountable, we hold groups accountable. But so often when we look at restorative practices, when people talk about restorative justice, they look at this last step. They look at resolve conflict, hold people accountable, but if there's not a relationship and there's not meaning and there's not that container of the classroom and of the school that makes space for that vulnerability and that risk that requires, it's not going to work. And then we're like, well, let's go back to a punitive approach. So this video is, I think it's a 3rd grade classroom. It's looking at dialogue circles to support classroom management. Feel free to pause the recording and watch it here, or switch over to YouTube. There's a link there for it. It's on Edutopia. And just watch that and sort of reflect on it in relation to everything else we've been talking about. All right, you done? Okay. So the final step is to write and send me a reflection about what skills you think, if you were going to integrate restorative practices into your classroom, what you feel like you would need to focus on first for students. There's a lot of curricula, there's a lot of approaches, and I definitely encourage you to look into it, but just instinctually, what do you think your class, your grade level, the students that you have known would need skill-wise to be able to really address harm with each other, really repair relationships, and really develop the skills to prevent their own behavior escalations and to stay safe within the context of escalations that may happen. All right, thank you. So that is it for this week. Again, as always, if you want me to respond to your reflection, please let me know. And if you are all set, then that's fine. I won't respond. I will be seeing you on the discussion boards. Thank you.